Hey, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the FlowCast. And in this episode, we're talking all about HRV. What is HRV or heart rate variability? We're going to get into how do we measure heart rate variability? What are good numbers or bad numbers? And is that even a thing? As well as how we can improve our HRV. These are going to be the core aspects of this important recovery metric that we'll be talking about in this episode. So let's get right into it. Thanks for tuning into another episode of the FlowCast. In this first season back, we've been talking about recovery and all things around recovery. And as I mentioned, this episode is going to be on heart rate variability. What this is going to do is tie together what we talked about in the first few episodes on measuring recovery, both subjectively and objectively, and understanding life cycle changes with recovery. And this is going to lead us into talking about things like nutrition for recovery, the different ways that we can look at promoting recovery through the different health dimensions and what that looks like. Recovery is not always just those physical aspects, but what are we doing emotionally or with our social dynamic to make sure that we're able to recover there? And so we'll be talking about the different health dimensions and how we can look at recovery in all the different aspects there. We're also going to talk specifically about mental recovery and how to promote more creativity and focus through recovery there, because I think that's a very important topic around everybody's so distracted these days and overwhelmed mentally with the amount of tasks on their plate. How can we focus on mental recovery so that we can become more creative and have that energy to do those big things that we want to accomplish? And we're also going to have a specific episode on workplace recovery and preventing burnout in the coming weeks on this first season of the FlowCast. So, first off, heart rate variability is a measurement of the beat to beat variations between our heart rate. Now, we often think about it with this metronomic rhythm that's very consistent and stable. And this is what a low HRV score would indicate, because there's not a whole lot of variation between each heartbeat. When we have higher heart rate variability, it's a suggestion and an indication that our parasympathetic nervous system is able to play together with the sympathetic nervous system that keeps that very rhythmic, metronomic quality to our heart rate. And so it's a measurement of this variability with high HRV indicating that we're able to activate that recovery phase, and low HRV is a suggestion that we're in a more stressed out or chronically activated state of stress and sympathetic activity. And this is important to know and to understand when it comes to measuring recovery, because it can lead to suggestions on overall how well we're able to recover or bounce back from hard efforts, whether that's physical or mental efforts, as well as just that overall number is important for being able to look at our trends and use this objective measurement as a way to give ourselves insight into when we're recovered or not and what we can do to improve and work from there. So heart rate variability is not something that we're able to just take a stethoscope or feel our pulse and look at the variability between heartbeats just by reading out our pulse. We need more specific and precise instruments like Apple Watches, Whoop bands, Oura rings, or chest strap heart rate monitors that allow us to look at these more minute variations between heartbeats. And this is going to give us that ability to measure our heart rate variability. Now, even something like a Fitbit is going to be able to measure HRV for us these days. And what I've found is that it's much more important to look at the long-term trends with our HRV than looking at variety throughout the day. Depending on what activities you've done or just finished up doing, it's going to quite dramatically fluctuate our HRV score throughout the day, which could lead us to think that we're more recovered or less recovered than maybe we actually are. And instead, what we should be looking at is more of the trend long term to get a sense of the variations in our stress levels and how recovered we are over weeks and over months. Because by looking at those more minute instances of our HRV, it may just lead us into thinking that we need to take action quicker than we actually do and kind of lead us to preemptively go into recovery mode when maybe we can still push hard without actually leading to burnout or increases in fatigue and diminishing returns on our performance. So I think it's important to take that into note first before we discuss any specific numbers, because I've noticed that even just within the span of several hours, if you're looking at a device that can measure more immediate results on your heart rate variability, like you can do by looking in your health panel on the Apple Watch, or with Whoop, they now have the stress monitor that takes into consideration things like heart rate variability to do more in the moment readings. And you can do the same thing with the Oura ring. If you start a breathing activity for at least, I think, 5 minutes, it will give you those daytime heart rate variability readings. Whereas if you don't do any of those kind of specific actions on these devices to get an immediate reading, typically what they're going to do is show you your heart rate variability score for sometime in the middle of your sleep cycle. And the reason for this typically is when our nervous system should be in most rest and digest or parasympathetic activity with the least amount of sympathetic activation going on. Now, this isn't always the case, or if it's somebody that does have a lot of sleep disturbances or a lot of, waking up in the middle of the night in kind of like that cold sweat state, then their HRV is still going to be affected by that. And that's probably a long-term trend that they're working on. So it's still going to be a more accurate overall rating of where you tend to fall in the HRV range. And so because heart rate variability can fluctuate so dramatically throughout the day, looking at your average and kind of finding out what your baseline is right now and looking at it over, the span of months is going to give you the best idea on where your performance is going. Is it going in a positive direction, or are you starting to reach a point of chronic fatigue or burnout because you've been pushing for too hard for too long? And so when we look at what good numbers are with heart rate variability, it's actually not that important to think of good versus bad. Now, I've seen and heard of numbers as high as averages of 80 or 90 with people like Ben Greenfield who try to biohack their HRV to be as high as possible over the long term. I think in my experience with working with people and seeing what their HRV scores look like, most of us fall in somewhere around the 50 to 60 millisecond range for our average HRV scores. And so that kind of is more of the typical baseline I see, even with some high level athletes and their performance. So it's not like good versus bad as much as knowing what your body's fluctuations look like that gives us the most insightful data around heart rate variability. Also, because our numbers can change so dramatically whether it's from having like a high stress work environment or work situation that we just came out of, or we had a really great chance to relax and do something very deeply parasympathetic. Or we've seen that with studying HRV, something like a light jog's not actually going to impact heart rate variability much, but if you do a very intense exercise workout, then the few hours afterwards, you're going to see this drop in heart rate variability, but it tends to stabilize pretty quickly. So, looking at these smaller scale numbers, it doesn't really mean a whole lot to us as much as figuring out what our average is, what our trend is looking like long term over time. So if we get more out of looking at HRV at rest and over the long term, then should we be measuring HRV in the first place, and what can we learn from it? These are the other two important things to dig into with HRV and how it relates to our recovery. So, should we be measuring HRV? I think it comes down to individual differences, which we talked about a little bit with objective versus subjective measurements. But, some people are very data driven and like to look at numbers, and this can motivate them. And if it's in the aspect of recovery, this could be a good thing, but also we can get a little bit obsessive around things like looking at the numbers and measuring it, or it can become quite tedious, in which case this could become a little bit more of a mental stress to us to constantly be watching our HRV and trying to fine tune things so that it's as perfect as possible. And I think that knowing yourself and knowing what type of individual you are with measurements and data is useful first on this question of should we be measuring heart rate variability. But also, if you are trying to make a change to improve your performance, or you're finding that you repeatedly go through cycles of burnout and you're not quite sure why, then looking at HRV can give you a solid insight into some of the trends and what is happening that you can probably improve on to prevent this burnout cycle or to see your performance move to the next level. So if you're going to make modifications to your routine, your training, or anything else in your schedule based on what you learn from HRV, it's a useful thing to include. But if you can get everything out of looking at just heart rate or breath rate or using like another more subjective based stress assessment, then maybe you don't necessarily need to buy a new device to look at your heart rate variability if it's not going to really elicit any further change from you or your routine at this time. When we look at HRV, what we get that we might not necessarily learn from any other measurement device are things like our stress level, especially not just around extraordinary circumstances where it's a high stress situation, because usually there are other things that, alarm us to those situations. But if it's our ordinary stressors in our everyday life, something could be off if we're finding that our HRV is lower than normal in those situations. And it's a suggestion and a good indicator that we could use more recovery time or look to make a change to prevent further declines. And heart rate variability has also been linked with being able to predict illness sooner than things like fever or increase in body temperature. So, by seeing this reduced HRV as an early onset of a cold or other illness coming on, we can use that to try to mitigate that cold or that illness and try to reduce the time that we are sick. And as we start to see how our HRV responds to things like higher intensity physical training or competitions, if we see a drop that's more than normal after one of these more intense activities, it can also let us know that it's probably not a good idea to push hard yet too soon and to give ourselves more recovery time because our body's not responding as quickly as normal to get back to baseline. And with this, it's actually a pretty good predictor of injury. So we're able to prevent injury and save ourselves with that recovery by looking at HRV and using it to kind of save us in this direction. Now, the final thing to go into today is how do we improve our heart rate variability? We're going to talk about some specific we're going to talk about some specifics around nutrition and what we can see that correlates between heart rate variability and nutritional choices in a coming episode. But looking at the research on heart rate variability and what can lead to increases in it, basically what it comes down to is if you have a higher overall fitness level, you likely also have a higher heart rate variability. So, by improving our fitness level, particularly cardiovascular fitness, we can also see our average HRV typically increase. Now, if it's in the middle of like a competition season, we will usually see that even somebody that's like an elite performer is going to have a lower average HRV than during their off season. I know looking at some of the athletes that have been sponsored by products like Whoop, we've seen that Patrick Mahomes follows this exact trend where during the competition season, his average HRV is slowly declining until it hits kind of its lowest point around playoffs and Super Bowl time, and then bounces dramatically back in the off season when he's got more time to recover and he's not training as intensely. And I've seen this with my own clients, with some of them who have faced injuries in the past and seen this huge drop off in their HRV. And then during their regular season, they've got, you know, lower than you would expect for their HRV, but it'll definitely bounce back and climb back up in the off season. And with this in mind, if they are somebody who's getting paid to play a sport or do some sort of physical performance, and they know that their average recovery or their average HRV and that amount of stress on their system is a bit higher during competition season, then they'd want to put into place recovery strategies for those other domains of their life and health in order to balance out that strain that is basically on their system so that they're not getting overwhelmed as much as possible outside of their physical pursuit. So what we've seen in the research as far as what types of fitness will lead to improvements in heart rate variability, light and moderate activity doesn't do anything to boost your overall trend in heart rate variability, nor does physical activity and the total amount of time in physical activity seem to make a difference. What makes the most appreciable difference, at least in males studied, is when you do high intensity activity, vigorous exercise, the type that you would typically expect to also see increases in VO2 max with, or overall fitness ability. Whether this vigorous activity effect also translates to females is still uncertain, which with working with clients, I've seen that HRV tends to be impacted by the ovulation cycle. So I'm not sure if that's why there's inconclusive evidence at this point, or if there just hasn't been enough research done on different populations with heart rate variability. But I would think that with that higher intensity activity, that is one thing, at least I've also seen in myself, leads to improvements in my overall average heart rate variability. That, and also anything else that's going to improve your cardio, is going to typically improve your average heart rate variability up to a certain point. And then I don't think that we can completely shift where our average HRV is that dramatically. But does that really make a difference? I don't think so. I think that more so we need to look at those trends again and see if we are staying around our baseline average, if we're seeing a drop off and like a slow decline over time, or if we're making slight improvements. But as long as we're not seeing those huge drop offs, then we know that our body's not in an excessively stressed state that it can't recover and bounce back from. And then there's also evidence around breathing exercises helping to improve heart rate variability. I've definitely seen this with small, like interstitial moment trends, but can see that the better that you get at breathing control and being able to tap into that, parasympathetic breathing style of slow exhales and not breathing high into your chest so that you're able to really get into that parasympathetic state, that type of breathing is going to make a difference on your heart rate variability because it's also going to impact your perception of stress and be able to handle more under that like higher stress state. So if you are looking to improve your heart rate variability, look at increasing your cardiovascular ability with high intensity exercise and make sure that you're working on your breathing so that you know how to do those deep parasympathetic breaths that help you to combat stress. So that's going to wrap up this episode of the FlowCast, talking about all things heart rate variability in this season on recovery. And I hope that you find this information helpful and that you can use it for your own recovery purposes and to see your performance go to the next level. And if you did like the video or like this podcast, make sure you've tuned in, subscribed wherever you like listening to podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the thumbs up to help it reach more people who we can also help out with their recovery needs. And as always, until the next episode, find your flow.